Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane Perez, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled, Treating Individuals Living with Domestic Violence and Substance Use. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the Q&A panel. The button to open the panel is usually located on the upper right side of your monitor. Please use the Q&A panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options are posted in the chat panel too. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. So if you guys are not hearing me at this time, you're going to want to do that telephone option and just by rejoining. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FADA website within 10 business days. To access the recording, go to www.fada.org. Also, a PDF version of this PowerPoint presentation will be emailed to you within a similar time frame. FADA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FADA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADA as part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 10 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation will close at midnight on Monday, September 16th. So statements of credit or to receive credits will not post until after September 16th. 1 to 2 continuing credit education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license number for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside the state of Florida, you don't need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Note, please, that WebEx monitors arrival and departure of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. And now I would like to introduce and welcome our presenter, Susie Kowalsky. She has been serving vulnerable communities for more than a decade through direct clinical services, as well as by delivering training and consultation to service providers. Susie works in Chicago as a therapist and a clinical supervisor at Threshold, supporting young people and their families who are experiencing a first episode of psychosis. As a trauma therapist, Susie has worked with diverse populations to address issues related to complex trauma, substance use, mental illness, chronic health conditions, sexual orientation and gender identity, couple and family relationships, and systemic oppression. Susie also runs Practice for Progress, where she provides trainings and consultations to students, clinicians, programs, and organizations on a local and national level. Her roles as a therapist, clinical supervisor, and consultant, Susie emphasizes a relational approach in which healthy connection facilitates the development of insight, practice of new skills, and curiosity for continued growth. And now, I would like to turn this over and welcome our presenter, Ms. Susie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Diane, for the warm introduction and for all of your work to bring this webinar together. I also want to thank SADA for bringing me in to conduct this webinar, and for those of you who are tuning in, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy week to join us this morning. Florida has definitely been in my thoughts, as it has been for a lot of us recently. My in-laws live in Hollywood, Florida, so hopefully all of you and your families are safe and sound after the hurricane, but it's nice to spend some time with some Floridians this morning, even if it's remotely. So, as Diane said, my name's Susie Kowalsky, and here's some ways to get in touch with me. I work in Chicago at a large community mental health organization, and then my husband and I actually work together on the side doing trainings and consultations as well. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after the training. It's always nice to hear from folks. I mentioned that I live in Chicago, and for many of us who live in Chicago, we somehow are always right next to the L, which is the train. So if you hear kind of a rumble go by at some different points this morning, that's just the joys of city living. In terms of my work history and experience as it pertains to today's webinar, I have worked in multiple domestic violence shelters as an advocate. I've worked with court-mandated domestic violence offenders as a therapist, and then I've also worked in a formal substance use treatment program. But I've also worked with many, many people who are impacted by these issues in a lot of settings that are not necessarily specifically designed to address domestic violence and substance use. So these are two issues that are just so incredibly widespread, and they're often really misunderstood, and a lot of the root causes for both domestic violence and substance use are often driven underground by shame and stigma. So that being said, I'm really honored that you're taking the time this morning to talk about these issues and to think together about how we can best serve the people who are impacted by them. Okay, so these are two huge topics, and we've got just 2 hours together this morning. At most domestic violence shelters, in order to work there, and often even to be a volunteer, you have to complete a 40-hour training before you can even walk in the door. So that's the starting point. And we've got 2 hours this morning together, so we're not going to try and cover all of the material that there is to cover or anywhere close to it. not only could we not do it, but it would just be really, really overwhelming to even try. So we're really just going to scratch the surface this morning, and I want to just kind of set that up as like a framework. We'll start out by talking about some introductory information about intimate partner violence, and then look at how that intersects with substance use, and wrap up by talking about how to best translate that information into practice. I guess backing up for a moment, the other thing that I want to mention about my background and experience is that although I wear a lot of different hats in my professional life, I really tend to identify as a trauma therapist first and foremost. So much of the way that I approach the work, the way I think about it, and how I put together trainings really comes out of my identity and role as a trauma therapist. And I mention that because trauma is really such an integral part of both domestic violence and substance use. And we'll be talking a lot today about how these different experiences tend to interact with and influence each other. And we'll be coming back to trauma-informed approaches as kind of a unifying theme. In general, when I provide trainings on trauma-informed care or trauma-related material, I think that it is a trauma-informed practice to talk at the outset about what to expect so that people have a sense of what to come. And then particularly for this topic, I just wanted to take a minute before we dive in to acknowledge and just say out loud that this is really heavy stuff. There's nothing light about the material that we're about to explore together. And on top of that, my assumption is that most people who are on this webinar right now have been impacted in some way by domestic violence and or by substance use, whether that's personally, through a friend or a family member, or professionally. And we carry that with us. It affects us because we're human, and these are really significant things that stay with us. So I want to let y'all know that there's nothing in this training that is intentionally designed to be shocking or upsetting. Definitely not going for any kind of shock value here. We aren't going to look at like graphic images or listen to 911 calls. We are going to watch a video, though, of a survivor talking about her experiences. It's not, she is not injured in the video. It's not overly graphic, but it is a true video of someone who is talking about what she has gone through. So I wanted to give you a heads up about that. I also want to say that just because there's nothing that is meant to elicit an upsetting response in you doesn't mean that it won't. This is really, really personal and subjective. And so I would ask that you all pay attention to your own responses as we go through the material this morning, and really tend to yourselves and notice with compassion what comes up for you. All right, so let's start by talking briefly about language. A lot of the field still primarily uses the term domestic violence, or DV, but we also see an increased use of the term intimate partner violence, or IPV. And the term intimate partner violence really acknowledges that these kinds of relationship dynamics can occur regardless of a couple's marital status, regardless of whether they cohabitate, and regardless of the gender of either partner. And so the term intimate partner violence is kind of challenges the notion that so-called domestic violence only occurs within a marital relationship with the husband abusing the wife. We know that these types of dynamics occur in all kinds of intimate relationships, and so that's really kind of where the term intimate partner violence comes from. Today, you might hear me use these terms, DV and IPV, somewhat interchangeably, Like I said, I've worked in domestic violence shelters, which refer to themselves as domestic violence shelters. A lot of the literature and material often talks about domestic violence. So you might hear me use both terms, but I just want to clarify that when I say domestic violence or DV, that I'm not referring to something different than intimate partner violence or IPV. There's definitely some debate about what to call the people on both ends who are involved in this type of relationship. So there's questions about the implications of using the terms either victim or survivor. In general, when I'm working with people, I'll adopt their language, and if someone refers to themselves as a victim of intimate partner violence, then I'll use the word victim with them. If they use the word survivor, I would mirror that as well. Sometimes people don't really identify with either term. But when we are describing and identifying people, it's less clear because we don't have their lead to follow in that like individualized kind of way. And there's some benefits of both. So sometimes people talk about the idea that using the word victim really recognizes the violence and control that people experience, and that it has that heaviness to it that is reflective of people's experiences. The word victim also sometimes can invoke the idea of like can be associated with death of people who've died as a result of intimate partner violence. And we want to speak to the reality that that's something that happens for people. People also talk about using the word survivor because that really reflects the ways that people are working to survive every single day and to stay safe. And that we think often of the word survivor of bringing about kind of like more notions of empowerment. We don't have great language for the other partner in the equation. Like I said, for the victim or survivor, I tend to, when I'm working with people, follow their lead as far as what kind of language they use. And very, very few people that I've come across are going to identify themselves as being a perpetrator or an offender or a batterer. Those aren't terms that people tend to identify with, which then makes it really hard for people to recognize their own role in these types of relationships or to feel a sense of responsibility, and then also to overcome their own sense of shame and stigma. But again, we have to have a way to describe people and talk about both parties involved. So I usually talk about someone who enacts violence. That tends to be the language that I'll use, but that still doesn't really feel like an adequate term. And I think it also doesn't necessarily recognize that there's a lot more to intimate partner violence than the physical acts of violence themselves. So I think we're still looking for a good way to refer to people. If any of you have any thoughts or things that you use, feel free to throw those in the Q&A because I'd love to hear from you. Gender pronouns. So about 85% of intimate partner violence victims are women. So overwhelmingly, women are the targets and victims of this type of violence. And so throughout the literature, throughout most reference materials and resources, you're going to see pronouns that reflect that. So a lot of times they'll talk about what can she do, what resources are available to her, and they'll use male pronouns for the person inflicting violence. At the same time, we also know absolutely that people of all genders can be both the victim or the person inflicting violence. So you will generally hear me using they, them pronouns today, and you'll see that in the materials just to be gender neutral. but that's not what you'll typically see in the literature. And then I want to kind of talk for a minute about, like, why does language matter? Why sometimes people feel a frustration that we get so particular about certain words and how we're describing people and situations. And I would say, first off, we work in a field where words are our primary tool. What I do for most of the day is talk and listen. And so the words that we use are really important, and we want to select them carefully and thoughtfully. Because the words we use to describe these types of dynamics and the people involved in many ways shapes and defines what type of behavior and relationship dynamic is and isn't included when we talk about intimate partner violence. Who is and is not included in these types of dynamics, and then how we approach treatment with folks and what our attitude is for the people involved. So our language does matter. And like I said, we work in a field where words are our primary tool. So what are we talking about when we talk about domestic violence? We're describing the willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and/or other abusive behaviors as part of a systemic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. This includes physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, and emotional abuse. The frequency and severity of domestic violence can vary dramatically. However, the one constant component of domestic violence is one partner's consistent efforts to maintain power and control over the other. So what this definition really emphasizes is that this is a pattern, and it's focused around power and control, and that it's systematic. Something that does not get included in this definition that can be sometimes a little controversial is instances where an argument between a couple escalates to violence or like single incidents of a behavior, because they're not necessarily part of a pattern, and there's not a consistent effort necessarily to maintain power and control. So I think it's important that we distinguish that when we talk about domestic violence, we are talking about a pattern of power and control. And I want to just say that that doesn't excuse or make okay some of the behaviors that don't necessarily fall within this definition. So how common is it? Unfortunately, it's very common. So we know that domestic violence occurs across all types of different demographics. Demographic information does not predict or prevent intimate partner violence, but it definitely impacts people's access to resources and the type of support that's available to them at both a personal and societal level. So it's not to say that people with more resources available and who fall into maybe a higher SES don't experience domestic violence, but we're less likely to encounter them in a shelter setting, for example. Domestic violence doesn't necessarily always include physical violence, but it often does. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember, is that it's not, and we'll talk more about this, but it's not, we're not just talking about physical acts of violence. We're talking about a more pervasive pattern that really defines the relationship. Domestic violence can definitely result in physical injury, psychological trauma, and even death. And then thinking about that psychological trauma, it can really last a lifetime, as can like the physical injuries and the implications. But the aftermath of it is really long lasting, and we see that patterns of intimate partner violence transmit across generations. So people who are exposed as children to intimate partner violence, whether they witness that in their home. If they witness that in their home, they're much more likely to be involved in some type of intimate partner relationship, again, as either partner, as an adult. Some more facts and figures. So on average, 20 people every minute are physically abused by an intimate partner, which is a really shocking statistic. We've been on this call for 26 minutes, so thinking about how many people in the time that we've just been together this morning have been physically abused is really heavy to sit with. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 4 men experience severe intimate partner violence. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience some form of violence by an intimate partner. So kind of like what we were talking about before, maybe some type of like single incident argument that's not part of a pattern, so it's not considered intimate partner violence, but we can see that violence within intimate relationships is really common, shockingly so. Intimate partner violence accounts for about 15% of violent crimes, and only 1/3 of the people who are injured by their partners receive any type of medical care for their injuries, which again makes us think about kind of like the long-lasting impacts of being physically injured but not seeking care. 1/3 of female murder victims and 1 in 20 male murder victims are killed by their intimate partners. 72%, almost 3/4 of murder-suicides are perpetrated by intimate partners, and every single day there are 20,000 calls made to domestic violence hotlines. So this information, I share this not to sensationalize, but just to understand that this is the reality of intimate partner violence, and this is really, really heavy data, and this type of relationship is extremely prevalent with some really staggering implications. So statistically speaking, the most dangerous place for a woman to be is at home. Women are most likely to be assaulted, abused, or killed by someone they know. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple different models for conceptualizing intimate partner violence. This one we refer to as the cycle of violence, and this is one of the earlier models. So if we start kind of on the bottom right at the honeymoon stage, that's where most relationships start. Relationships characterized by IPV tend to start really intensely and move very quickly, but not always. But there's the honeymoon stage. We think of this as kind of like hearts and flowers, and things feel really great. And then we move into tension building. And this is maybe where a lot of people describe this as feeling like they're walking on eggshells. There might be name calling, criticisms, threats, sarcasm, so kind of being sarcastic about someone's concerns. We definitely see a lot of jealousy that comes up in this stage, accusations about things that maybe have occurred, and the beginnings of some controlling behavior. And then over time, the tension gets high enough that we have an explosive incident. So this could be physical violence, some type of outburst, intimidating body language, constraining someone from leaving, throwing things, slamming doors. And then after the explosive incident, typically we return to hearts and flowers in the honeymoon stage. And this time around, there's apologies. A lot of times we see, we hear about relationships that feel more respectful. There might be improved communication. The partner might be more attentive, help out more. promise to change, and spend some quality time together. And then over time, things move back into tension building. The other thing we see is that over time, some relationships tend to move through the cycle more quickly. So the first few times around, it's not uncommon for couples to stay in the honeymoon and tension building stage for many, many months or even years. And over time, we see that this starts to move more quickly. Healthy relationships are able to forego the explosive incident. So there's that honeymoon stage, which is typically where relationships begin. And then all relationships have their tense moments and have arguments and things that they need to sort out. Most people in relationships have had some period of time where things feel more tense. You might be more on edge with each other. We're able to resolve that and get back to a honeymoon stage and kind of cycle through in this way. I like to use the cycle of violence with clients to help them kind of conceptualize some of the experiences that they're having in their relationship. So I've worked with a lot of people who are describing the cycle to me, but they're not familiar with like this model. So it can be helpful to talk through like what their specific relationship looks like at the different stages, and then be able to like help them anticipate and prepare for what might come next, and be able to like develop some safety plans and coping skills. This, I think, can be really validating for folks to understand that there is a pattern to their relationship, so then they can start to understand that pattern and engage with it in a different way. A lot of survivors, though, didn't really identify with the cycle of violence. Like I said, that was kind of an earlier model of DV. And so they felt like the cycle of violence kind of implied that the explosive incident was the only time that they were experiencing abuse. And a lot of people, in this case, a lot of women, reported that that really didn't reflect their experience of intimate partner violence. So the power and control wheel was developed by conducting a lot of interviews and listening to the experiences of women who are impacted by intimate partner violence. So the way this model works is that at the center, kind of at the hub of the wheel, are these dynamics of power and control. And then around the spokes are more subtle and ongoing tactics that an abuser might use, if we maybe think of them as kind of like microaggressions. And then the outer ring are the acts of violence. These are the more overt and forceful behaviors that really reinforce the regular use of the more subtle methods of abuse. The physical violence is kind of what holds all of this together. And so if we think also then about the outermost ring, these are like the broader systemic forces that tend to support these dynamics. So without systemic like misogyny and sexism, patriarchy, and like institutions, it would be harder to maintain this system of power and control. So going through this wheel, starting kind of like 1 o'clock, we see intimidation. So this might be things like making someone feel afraid by using like looks or gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, displaying weapons, but this can also be subtle. I worked with someone whose partner, whenever he was about to assault her, would take off his wedding band. And so he would sometimes take off his ring as a form of intimidation. So it's a really hard and subtle thing to say, well, what happened? What happened is my partner took off their ring. But again, this is all held together by these incidents of violence and it's all part of a system of power and control. Emotional abuse is quite common in these relationships, really humiliating a person, making them feel guilty, kind of causing someone to second guess themselves. We sometimes hear about the term gaslighting that would fall under emotional abuse, and that's kind of provoking someone and then denying that you've done anything. That sometimes we hear it also referred to as like crazy making, and it really makes the person start to doubt themselves and question their own judgment and perception. So I've heard of someone whose partner would move the pictures in their home that were hanging on the walls, would like move them around. And then when she would comment on it, he would be like, "What are you talking about? Like, that's always been there. You're losing your mind." So really undermining someone's ability to trust themselves and making them feel like, "I think I'm losing it." Isolation is another key aspect of IPV. Really controlling what someone does, who they see, who they talk to, what they read, where they can go, and really limiting outside involvement. It makes a lot, it can definitely contribute to like the other spokes on the wheel. If someone's isolated and they don't have someone else to say like, "No, of course those pictures were never there before," and to really validate a person's experience. But if someone's isolated, they're sort of stuck with just the other person's input. A lot of times we also see people use jealousy as a way to justify the isolation, saying that, I don't want someone else to take you away from me. We see a lot of minimizing and blaming, so making light of the abuse, not taking concerns about it seriously, outright denying that it happened, or shifting responsibility and saying that if you would just listen to me, I wouldn't have to do this, or if you had only complied in this other way, this wouldn't have happened to you. When there are children involved, we can see partners making someone feel guilty about the children, using children to relay messages back and forth when parents are separated. We've seen instances of visitation being used to harass the other partner, or threatening to take the children away, or threatening to harm the children. We'll talk more about the systemic pieces, but it's considered, at least I know in Illinois and in Colorado where I worked, it's considered part of domestic violence to witness, or child abuse to witness domestic violence, which puts partners in a really tricky situation. We can also see people using economic abuse, kind of giving someone an allowance, making them ask for money, making them account for all of their money, or not allowing them to have access to the family income, or not being able to get or keep a job. We certainly can see aspects of using privilege, making all the decisions, sort of behaving like the master, being the one to define each person's role in the relationship, or stating that this is their right as a partner. And then last but not least, we can see coercion and threats. So making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the person, threatening to commit suicide if the person leaves, threatening to report them to child welfare, or threatening to out them if there's some type of status, like maybe someone in an LGBTQ status, someone's medical status, someone's documentation status. So these are the different pieces that people really identify with that kind of hold these systems together. And I will say the power and control wheel, I typically won't use this with people unless they've already identified that their relationship is abusive and they're seeking support around that. Otherwise, as you could imagine, this could be pretty overwhelming for someone to look at. this is really helpful for people who are already in like a domestic violence shelter or seeking support around it. It can feel really, really validating. So here is just the full version that gives some more examples. So I just included this for your reference. So now we're going to go ahead and watch a video. So Diane, if you could, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hello, everyone. It'll just take a few minutes for me to get the audio video up, and we'll start playing.
Okay. So in listening to Sarah's story and thinking about the power and control wheel, if you all can put in the Q&A, what components of the power and control wheel did you hear her describing? Yeah, lack of independence, threat, not allowing her to leave, definitely a lot of intimidation, feeling really isolated. Absolutely. So I chose this video because I think it really brings to life the ways that that it's not just one single episode, and it's not limited to physical violence. That intimate partner violence is a much bigger system that really centers on power and control, and we can see that. And absolutely, Sharon, I agree that isolation was a really big part of her story. And we'll talk later about kind of how we can respond as providers when we encounter these types of dynamics. So the power and control wheel has a lot of different adaptations. So the one that I shared with you now is kind of the most general version, but there's one specific to bullying, child abuse, for children coping with family violence. There's one that talks about immigrants, legal charges, people in the LGBTQ community, older adults, post-separation, teens, and workplace abuse. So, there's actually, I would probably say quite a bit more, but if I go back here where you can see where there's like all the specific examples, the different versions have like more specific examples of what that might look like for different populations. So the equality wheel is kind of meant to be the antidote or the flip side to the power and control wheel. So I really like using the equality wheel as a way to talk with someone about the dynamics in their relationship. If there's someone I'm working with and I'm hearing some red flags and I'm a little concerned, but they're not coming and saying, yeah, I'm really scared, this seems like a real problem, I'll use the equality wheel. So I'll kind of talk with someone about, you know, when you think about a healthy, solid relationship, what kind of qualities do you think are present? And be able to affirm someone's idea, introduce the equality wheel, and then point out some of the areas that they've already discussed, and then kind of talk through, like, what parts of your relationship do you think line up well with this? What are some areas you could work on? And are there any like more significant concerns that come up as you look at this? So I like the equality wheel as a way of helping people understand what kind of dynamics would be present in a healthy relationship. So now we're going to kind of look at how intimate partner violence and substance use intersect with each other. So these two topics, intimate partner violence and substance use, they share a lot of space together. They're two issues that are really entrenched in stigma. They're often surrounded by shame, and they're really closely related to trauma, and we often see them co-occur. It's important for us to understand, though, that substance use does not cause domestic violence. There's definitely a strong correlation, but I want to be really careful and intentional to avoid implying any kind of causal link. We also know that substance use can affect one or both partners, and we know that there are plenty of people who use substances that don't engage in intimate partner violence, and plenty of people engage in intimate partner violence that don't use substances. Both substance use and intimate partner violence I think of as like a relationship dynamic that can start out sometimes as a pretty good thing in a person's life. It can be a source of comfort and enjoyment, and that we see over time the dynamics change, and that it becomes an unhealthy relationship that really escalates in its severity as well as the frequency. So we know that these are two fields that have a lot of overlap in their population, but they tend to operate really separately. And that can definitely be a barrier to adequately addressing the needs of the people that show up in our programs. We also know that treating one issue and not the other can really interfere with treatment being effective. Not addressing domestic violence in a substance use treatment program is associated with like lower outcomes and can also contribute to relapse. At the same time, I will say that a lot of times I think domestic violence programs don't always have a great understanding of how substance use affects a relationship, and that also really limits their ability to understand and meet people's needs. So we know that about a quarter to half of men who commit acts of domestic violence have a co-occurring substance use problem. and that women with substance use problems are more likely to experience domestic violence. Survivors of domestic violence are also more likely to receive and become dependent on prescription drugs and alcohol. And that childhood physical abuse is associated with later substance use among young people. So clearly there's an association between substance use and domestic violence, but that's also not the only factor. Like we can see here, witnessing or experiencing family violence during childhood is also a risk factor, as is a history of childhood aggression. So I also want to acknowledge, and we'll talk a little more later, kind of stepping back, the role of like societal norms that directly or indirectly excuse violence in general, but also particularly against women, and some of the other systems that contribute to maintaining patterns of intimate partner violence. So what does that mean for treatment? So this affects, domestic violence affects treatment both directly and indirectly. So if we think about a relationship where a partner seeks substance use treatment and they're experiencing both IPV and substance use, and they decide, I really want to go make some changes to my substance use, that can feel really threatening to an abusive partner. It's a sign that this person is taking some form of action and sort of like power to make things better in their life. It means that they're going to be opening up to other people about the struggles that they experience in their life, and that they're also going to be moving outside of that isolated control. And so we can see sometimes where then the abusive partner can become more violent or threatening, and so the partner might stop going to treatment as a result. So even when substance use treatment and recovery is really important to someone, we can also absolutely understand that if a person's safety and well-being feels like it's in jeopardy by going to treatment, that they're not going to participate any longer in treatment. We also know that there are times where the dynamics of the relationship can result in someone discontinuing their treatment services. We have seen times where a partner is really controlling and can kind of sabotage someone's recovery. And then, like I said, just having increased like anger and threats about someone participating in treatment. There's also a lot of relationships where substance use is part of intimate partner violence, and intimate partner violence is part of substance use, and the two of them are kind of interwoven. There are relationships where a partner might be forced to use substances, either to control them, to make them easier to control, as a way for the partner to like demonstrate their loyalty or obedience to the other partner, or as a way to bring shame upon them, especially if someone has maybe had a period of abstinence or made progress in their recovery, of being able to sort of force them and coerce them into using substances as a way to demonstrate their inability to make changes. There are also relationships where substance use is part of the couple making up, or just part of what works well in their relationship. Sometimes we see couples where they really bond and enjoy using together. It's a way for them to like reconcile or feel close together, and that sometimes their relationship might actually be going better when they're using together. Not always the case, but certainly sometimes it can be. So it kind of brings us to the last point, that the severity of abuse might be impacted by the level of intoxication or sobriety for one or both partners, but that we can't assume that sobriety is safer. So there are some partners who are more abusive when they're using, but there are also some partners who are less abusive when they're using. I've worked with survivors who have said that their partner is easier to like placate or manage or escape from when intoxicated. And then, like I said, there are also couples where they get along better when they're using, and there's less violence. So these are really tricky and nuanced things for us to be thinking about when you encounter people in treatment, and to understand kind of the complexity of how their intimate partner violence dynamics might affect their participation in treatment, and their needs. So, one of the difficulties is that we have these two systems that share a lot of the same population, but they have really different priorities as far as treatment. They use different terminology and often have kind of a different philosophy of care and the whole approach to the work. So in substance use, typically the focus of treatment is going to be on sobriety or recovery, however the person defines that, ideally, but typically in substance use treatment programs, the goal is an abstinence-only approach. Intimate partner violence programs really emphasize safety and empowerment. And so absolutely, we know that both goals are really valid, and the reality is that they can be really difficult to balance out in practice. So this often puts staff in kind of this difficult place of feeling like these two goals can't coexist and they have to either focus on one or the other, especially in order to kind of stay true to like the mission of their program and to be fulfilling whatever it is their role is, depending on, you know, their setting. And I think the more we understand about the dynamics of substance use and intimate partner violence, the more we recognize that an either-or approach is just not going to be effective, and that we need to be flexible and kind of take things on a case-by-case basis, but also really collaborate with the people in our programs who are experiencing these types of things, to hear from them how to identify and prioritize their needs and goals. So I want to come back quickly to language, because this is another area where it feels like the fields of substance use and intimate partner violence can be somewhat at odds with each other. So the field of intimate partner violence tends to really use a lot of words like empowerment, rebuilding control. There's a lot of focus on resiliency and safety. And people in the domestic violence field tend to feel and have a reaction to some of the words that we use in substance use treatment, and find terms like someone being in denial or being codependent, powerless, having a disease, to be really stigmatizing and kind of counter to the goals of domestic violence survivors. Thinking about someone having a disease and using this medical model is going to be really hard for people in the intimate partner violence field, to think about implying that survivors are sick when they've been battered by another person. So again, I think this just kind of highlights the need for like a more coordinated system of care and a more unified system between these two fields, so that we aren't sort of so fragmented, and we're not going to be as effective in being able to like interrupt cycles of violence, fear, intimidation, guilt, and continued substance use or relapse that really jeopardizes people's recovery if we're not able to get more on the same page. So I think then the question is, so where do these two fields meet in the middle, and what kind of approaches do they have in common? And that's where trauma-informed care comes into play. So why don't we go ahead and take a quick break right now, and then when we come back, we'll pick up by talking more about trauma-informed care and how that can apply. So I'll go ahead and take any questions that have come up at this time.
If anyone has any questions at this time, please go ahead and post them in the chat or the Q&A panel, and we'll go ahead and answer those. Okay, Susie, I think our participants don't have any questions at this time. And if you do, please go ahead and write them up and post them in the Q&A or the chat panel, and we'll come back in 5 minutes at 11:06, and we'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you. Hello, and welcome back. This is Diane Perez. And Susie, we do have some questions that populated. Would you like to answer those questions at this time? Hello, Susie?
Yep, sorry, I realized I had a double mute going on. Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay. What are some helpful strategies to increase a mother's protective capacities without using language that re-victimizes her? For example, how do you get someone to see how her choice to keep an abusive partner around her child is a bad decision and can lead to DCF removing from her custody?
So that's a really great question without a simple answer. I think I would probably start by trying to understand the person's experience and hearing a little bit more from them about how this impacts them, because I think it's really easy for us to look and come from our own protective view of seeing like this doesn't seem like this is helpful for this family. And I think there's probably a much more nuanced and complicated situation at play. And I think the more we can understand that and the person can feel understood in it, the more we can start to generate some potential solutions together. And then I think trying to identify what resources are available to the person, because very often in my experience of working with people, it's not that they didn't want to protect themselves or their children, it's that the resources that they would need in order to do that weren't available. So they were kind of in a position of trying to make the least harmful decision for themselves and their family, if that makes sense. And then I also see that Sarah Shepard shared that there's a training called Futures Without Violence that has some great tools and skills. So thanks for sharing that, Sarah.
The other one question is, are you going to be addressing coercive control and how in the UK it is considered a crime someone can serve jail time for?
Sorry, I missed that. Will I be addressing what?
Coercive control?
Coercive control?
Yes.
I'm not sure what that's referring to. So I won't specifically be addressing that. But if whoever posed that question can be more specific, I can try and address that. But yeah, I would need a little more information.
Okay. That is all the questions at this time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Diane. So where we left off was saying that these are two systems that can sometimes feel like they really are approaching a very overlapping population from different perspectives, and how can we find a common ground where we kind of meet in the middle, and what sorts of things do these two fields have in common. And I really am a big advocate of trauma-informed care in general, but in particular with these two fields, I think it's a really nice fit. I think it's something that makes a lot of sense for both substance use and intimate partner violence, and is a good place to start. So, okay. So what are we talking about with trauma-informed care? I like this definition from SAMHSA that talks about the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. So we want to realize how widespread trauma is. And in this case, we're talking about, we want to realize the prevalence and impact of intimate partner violence and substance use. We want to be able to recognize red flags within relationships and signs that someone has been affected by IPV, and particularly because of the shame and secrecy and stigma surrounding IPV, people aren't necessarily going to come forward with this kind of information on their own, so it's really important that we be able to recognize the signs ourselves. We want to know how to respond appropriately, both at the individual level, but also especially at the administrative and policy level. And then we want to do all this without re-traumatizing a survivor, understanding that the risk for re-traumatization is really high. So how do we recognize intimate partner violence? When we are working with a person and they don't come in and say, here's what's happening in my relationship, and it's definitely part of IPV, how can we kind of have our antennas like finely tuned, like sensitively tuned for it? We know that the effects of intimate partner violence often present as mental health conditions. So we can see people coming in who might be depressed, who might be highly anxious, who might have a lot of difficulty trusting people. Certainly, we're going to see a lot of PTSD symptoms. So someone who might be hypervigilant, someone who might have some dissociative qualities at times. We also know that a lot of women who were diagnosed with mental health conditions weren't ever asked about their relationships or trauma history. So we're kind of just looking at the symptoms at the surface level and not really understanding like what's underneath them and what might be causing that, and recognizing that their relationships might be a source of trauma that could very well account for a lot of the symptoms that someone presents with. That being said, there are some people who will need additional services to address their mental health conditions and are going to need support around their depression, their anxiety, their trauma. And I also just want to say that like that's not a justification for someone being abused, and that it's not because of someone's mental health conditions that they're abused. Again, it's about like a systemic system of pattern of power and control. We see that for a lot of people who are in domestic violence relationships, their symptoms that they presented with, their mental health symptoms, resolve when they're feeling safe and supported. We also want to think really carefully about the implications of diagnosing people with a mental illness and what that could mean for their custody and court cases. That if we're saying this is someone who presents with a lot of symptoms of depression, but we haven't sort of looked underneath to recognize that this is someone whose depression really stems from their traumatic experience of abuse. That has really significant implications if they're trying to file for custody of their child, for example. So just things that we want to be really thoughtful about. And thinking about intimate partner violence, I think one way to frame it is to think of it as like a multi-event and deliberate trauma that's affected by another person. And that can have really significant impact on a person's memory. So we know in general that trauma has a very significant impact on people's body and brain. And this type of interpersonal trauma that is often chronic can lead to a lot of problems with like dissociation and amnesia. So it's not going to be uncommon, and we should almost anticipate that when we're working with survivors, we might hear stories that are fragmented and don't necessarily follow like a clear linear path. And that's not something for us to be suspicious of or to then question the validity of the story. It's part of our trauma-informed responsibility to recognize that this is part of the effects of intimate partner violence and trauma, that the way that this has affected this person makes it difficult for them, like really at the cellular level in their brain, to be able to maintain their memory in this way. I know that sometimes I've worked in settings where people are doubted because their stories don't quite line up and things don't exactly make sense, and there's not a clear objective account, and they're not able to describe exactly what happened and when. And it's part, again, of our responsibility to anticipate and know that that is because of the effects of the trauma that they've experienced. So rather than trying to get this really linear, detailed account, our focus is really to try and understand survivors' memories of their abuse and to understand their perspective. We also know that we need to start where people are. That's something we hear all the time in the field, is meet people where they're at. And we can anticipate them when we're working with IPV survivors. That's not going to be with like a very detailed verbal account of their abuse. We know in general that that's not something we can expect from trauma survivors, that trauma starts as a very body-based internal experience that can be really difficult for people to verbalize in like a clear, linear manner. So this really speaks to the importance of screening for intimate partner violence and substance use treatment programs. Certainly we want to do this at intake, but we also want to do it throughout treatment. We know that people are often really reluctant to disclose the amount of violence that's actually happening in their lives. And this is true whether they're the people inflicting violence or receiving it. We know that substance use treatment is a male-dominated field. A lot of the people that we're going to see in our programs are going to be male-identified. And we know that intimate partner violence is primarily enacted by men. So working in substance use treatment, you're going to be really likely to encounter people who are involved in intimate partner violence, and we need to find ways to be able to screen not just for survivors, but also for people who are enacting violence. What kinds of things do we want to ask about? If you come out and ask someone during an intake and ask them too directly and ask too much about what kind of things are happening and if they're being violent, we're really, really unlikely to have someone come out and say, yeah, this is what's happening. More than likely what's going to happen is they're going to get overwhelmed and we're probably not going to see them again, or we're just not going to hear about this. It's important that we ask about physical health conditions and injuries. This gives us some kind of indirect way to gather information that might signal domestic violence without necessarily having to ask about it head on. Also, even if we were asking about it directly, we want to know about any kind of injuries and health conditions. We want to ask about someone's stressors and supports. In general, I think that's a good thing, along with relationship dynamics. Those are important things for us to know about in substance use treatment in general, but then thinking about adding this layer of kind of screening for intimate partner violence, again, we can start to kind of screen and get a sense of, are some of these other dynamics at play here? This also helps us to be able to identify someone's resources and strengths that's going to help us work with them. The other thing, though, is that this is really a highly, highly sensitive subject, and it's not easy to ask these questions, and it's not easy for people to answer them. For people who are involved in domestic violence in any kind of way, it's really difficult to disclose this information to someone. And then if we think about the implications of people who might be court mandated, who might have a partner who's known in the community, there's all sorts of dynamics that add to it. But in general, this is not information that's easy for people to disclose. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we frame questions. And again, I would say that that is something that's kind of beyond the scope of today's training, but really points to the need for additional training on working with and assessing for intimate partner violence in substance use treatment settings. I think in general, one of the goals in framing screening questions is that we want to make very clear to survivors that we want to determine whether there's abuse and substance use happening within the relationship, but we also want to make clear that substance use is not a justification for violence. With potential batterers, we want to assess what type of violence might be happening in the relationship without allowing the batterer to place blame on their substance use. And those are really difficult tasks. The other thing that I would say in general about assessing for intimate partner violence is that we want to use we want to specifically describe behaviors and not use labels. I've worked with people who had experienced horrific physical violence, but if you ask them, you know, does your husband abuse you? They'd say, no, definitely not. So we need to be specific about the behaviors. Even sometimes something as much as like, has this person ever choked you? I worked with someone who said, no, he just sometimes puts his hands around my neck and squeezes, but he just needs to get my attention when I'm not listening. So people don't tend to identify with the labels. We need to be specific about the behavior. We also want to get a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between substance use and violence. It's really complex. It's not so simple as someone gets intoxicated and then they become violent. So we want to know, when does violence occur relative to substance use? Is it before, during, after, all of the above? And how much of the violent behavior happens while one or both people are intoxicated, and what are the dynamics there? We want to know specifically what substances are being used. Are there certain substances that tend to increase the likelihood of violence? And then are there other substances that tend to decrease the chances of violence? What types of feelings and particularly relationship dynamics are happening before and during the use of substances? Is it that there's an explosive incident and there's a lot of anger and then there's substances used? Are things kind of calm and okay, and then substances are used and things change? So we want to have an understanding of that. We want to know, are substances used to recover from the violence, both interpersonally, so within the relationship, is this part of kind of like the making up process, and then also individually. After violence has occurred, does one or both partners use substances as a way to kind of cope with what's happened? And then we also want to know what's the role of substance use in some of the non-physical aspects of intimate partner violence. So how does substance use affect finances? Sexual acts are definitely physical, but different type of violence. Is there more threatening behavior? Is there more jealousy? Is there more isolation when substances are being used? So in general here, the point is just that we really don't want to assume, and we want to really explore and unpack this relationship because we need this kind of information to understand the dynamics that are at play before we can start strategizing with someone about what we might do. Again, none of us, we all come to this work because we care deeply about it. This is not an easy, light topic. It's really heavy work, and it's heavy material. And so sometimes we tend to want to problem solve and fix because we care about the people who are involved. If we're doing the work well, it affects us to see people we care about being harmed. And part of our job is to slow ourselves down and try and unpack these things a little bit more before we move into problem solving. Because often I think we don't totally understand what the problem is before we try and solve it. So I wanted to hear from you all. Do your programs screen for intimate partner violence? Do you have some type of built-in system, either at intake or throughout treatment, where you're asking about intimate partner violence and trying to assess for it? So if you all can put your responses in the Q&A. So at least one person does. That's great. A couple of you screen for it. Okay, sometimes they're assigned clients after DV has occurred. Okay. So it looks like a lot of you do, which is great. And I see that a lot of this happens during intake. Awesome. Okay. So what, I'm curious to hear, what do you think your programs are doing well in terms of screening, and what kind of changes do you think would be helpful to make? You screen based on the trauma-based tool, Carlene Robinson. That's cool. Use the ACEs. That's great. I love the ACEs. Yeah, we need more training for all staff, more time. It's always great to have. I hear you. Add a DV screening during the intake process. Be more specific about partnership issues. This is great. So part of it is, you know, my own curiosity and to get you thinking, but I love what's happening here. You all have some great ideas. I would recommend really kind of looking through the Q&A yourselves and thinking about, are there other ideas that you're seeing people bring up here that would be helpful to bring back to your programs? I hear a question about what is ACEs. ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences, and there was a study done on it, so that's usually the S. And the ACEs are 10 specific items that people can be asked about of whether they experienced those things during their childhood. And there was a study done, a huge study. It had like over 10,000 participants in it that really strongly correlates to long-term health outcomes, along with not just like health outcomes, but like life outcomes. So you're asking, will the ACEs be provided along with the PowerPoint of this training? I don't have the ACEs in here. We reference them, but I don't talk too much about the ACEs here. And then including the perpetrator in treatment definitely can be helpful. I'll say, Karen, that's something that we want to be really cautious about, though, because if there is active abuse happening, that's usually contraindicated. As we kind of heard in Sarah's story, sometimes abusers can be very charming and can really minimize what's happening, which can then put the survivor at more risk if they're kind of talking more openly with the perpetrator there. So typically what we recommend is that they have separate treatments until violence has stopped and things are different, and then we can do more treatment together. So thank you all for these great ideas. This is really helpful. So what can we do when intimate partner violence is disclosed? First and foremost, we want to address safety. So we want to find out what kind of safety risks and concerns the person has, what kind of resources are available to them, but also we want to know like what they want to do. We want to assure the person that they're believed. I was thinking about that when we were listening to Sarah's story earlier, when she was saying that she ran to her rabbi and disclosed what was happening and that he didn't believe her. And I can only think about how damaging that would be for someone to have the courage to tell someone this is something that's happening in my life and in my relationship, and to break that culture of silence that surrounds intimate partner violence, and then have someone say, I don't think that could happen, which I think contributes then to that sort of like crazy making feeling of like, did I make it up? Am I just making something out of nothing? Maybe this isn't a big deal. So we really want to assure the person they're believed. I will say, in general, when people disclose things to me, I have a habit of thanking them and really affirming that I appreciate how much courage it took for them to share that with me, and just that I really appreciate them doing that. We also know that affirming people's experience helps empower people, and then they can be more active in participating in problem solving and long-term treatment planning. We want to collaborate with people to identify options, and I emphasize here that we're going to collaboratively do this. We may have all sorts of really great ideas about what would be really helpful for this person, and something we'll continue to talk about, but I can't emphasize enough, is that when we're working with survivors of intimate partner violence, it's crucially important that we don't tell them what to do. If we take someone who has come from a relationship characterized by power and control, and we tell them, okay, here's what you need to do, and here's how you have to do it, even if it comes from a really good place of us wanting the person to be safe and protected, we're inadvertently recreating the same dynamics of powerlessness and control that they just left, or might still be a part of. We also want to assess for any kind of health concerns, including whether the person needs any kind of detox or medical care. So my next question for you all is, what kind of resources and referrals do you need to build in your network in order to effectively work with people experiencing intimate partner violence? I started out my postgraduate career as an outreach worker, and something that I learned then that has been one of the most valuable lessons of my career is that knowing your community resources and knowing who else is out there and having people in your network is a crucial aspect of this work. So I'm curious to hear, what kind of resources do you all think would be important to have in your arsenal? If you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A. Absolutely. So housing that allows pets. I love that you include pets. Whether people have children or not, oftentimes pets become such a source of soothing for people that I've definitely worked with people who don't want to leave home because they're really worried about what's going to happen to their pet. We want to definitely know about local shelters, school resource officers, social workers, support groups, shelters that allow adult children. Those are really hard to come by. So if any of you know of these things, please share them with each other. Shelters, meetings, legal aid services, and other shelters. Absolutely. These are awesome. Someone to go for help at all hours. A lot of times that's going to be by phone for like a 24-hour crisis line. But absolutely, these are awesome. Yes, legal advocates, kind of financial resources. I also think about parenting resources, which kind of speaks to the question that came up before, materials in Spanish. That's great. Someone says we have a program, Family Partnership Network, that incorporates a variety of resources involving domestic violence programs, and it's a great program. Thank you, Lydia, for sharing that. So again, I would recommend to network with each other and other providers that you work with, maybe for reasons not necessarily related to intimate partner violence, and find out like what shelters do people tend to have a good relationship with? Is there a specific staff member there that they can help introduce you to? Is there a lawyer or a legal aid program that works with low-income people, and can you try and connect us? So I would recommend absolutely kind of sharing resources with each other and trying to find ways to do sort of a warm handoff or introduction, so that if and when you need to contact places, you're not kind of cold calling, but you might have some more information about, you know, this is a place that was highly recommended. Cool. Thank you all. So in thinking about trauma-informed care, we kind of talked before about like, what is it? And I like to think of these key principles of being sort of the how of trauma-informed care. How do we practice trauma-informed care? So absolutely, we're going to emphasize safety and recognize that people in intimate partner violence relationships or fleeing them might be in a great amount of danger. So we want to do things like ask permission about leaving messages or sending emails. If we call someone or they call us, asking if they're in a safe place to talk. We want to think about safety with like technology and websites, definitely talking with people about safety plans, and some like seemingly small things that I've heard over the years that I think can be really helpful. Things like, especially in Florida where everyone drives everywhere, parking your car facing out rather than pulling in, so that if you need to leave quickly, it's easier to leave quickly. Definitely talking about confidentiality in the community. So if we happen to see each other and we're out, in general with any kind of client, we're not going to approach a client and be like, oh, hey, good to see you. But just being more aware that even something like indicating that we know someone that we happen to run into at the grocery store might put them in danger, because they could be with a partner who's like, who is that and why do they know you? And then we want to be really, really vigilant about releases of information and privacy. So I have definitely worked in shelters where we've had partners who call pretending to be another provider. and who are looking for their partner to find out, are they at a shelter? Where are they? And we'll pretend to be another provider and say, hey, I'm calling about so-and-so. So being really vigilant about saying, you know, without a release of information, I can't confirm or deny that I know that person, and following through with getting the release. We want to really emphasize trustworthiness and transparency. So we want to be clear with people about what our expectations and guidelines are, but also about the dynamics and principles that guide our work together. So I'm always really transparent with people in general, but particularly thinking about DV survivors, about the fact that like you call the shots, and really empowering someone that it's not my job to make decisions for you, and then sort of holding ourselves accountable. We fall into a trap where people might say, well, what do you think I should do? I'm really confused and overwhelmed. Just tell me what I should do. And being able to avoid that trap and be able to talk with someone about the fact that, like, yeah, this is a really hard decision, and I really trust that you can make this decision for yourself. It's actually really important. Let's talk it through together. So we're still going to accompany the person, but we're not going to overstep, and so we're going to be really firm in our boundaries. We definitely want to bring in peer support. It absolutely can build empowerment for someone who's been really disempowered to be able to be of assistance to another person. I kind of talked about collaboration and mutuality, but we want to really demonstrate a shift in power dynamics and actively elicit someone's input. Again, the more we tell a survivor what it is that they need to do, the more we're reinforcing the power and control dynamics of the relationship. We want to give people voice and choice, asking things like what someone wants to do when they go back home. We might not want them to go back home, but we still want to talk with them about what their options are and how they can keep themselves as safe as possible. And then last but not least, we really want to think about considerations for different cultures and different dynamics from like a married couple with a male abuser and a female identified survivor. Men are much less likely to report abuse by female partners and even more so by male partners. We want to be really aware of the cultural factors that influence relationship dynamics, and then also thinking about societal factors that influence survivors' options. So that kind of brings us to this idea and this question that comes up of why don't they leave? I will say, if you work in the field of intimate partner violence, there's a really good chance that people in your life will ask this question, sometimes with genuine curiosity, and they really don't understand and will really want to know, like, why doesn't the person just leave? And so I think it's worth being able to talk through with people who aren't in the room for these kinds of conversations. So that being said, this is not a trauma-informed question, right? Asking why someone doesn't leave kind of covertly places responsibility for violence on the victim. So some better questions are, why are they abusive? Or why aren't they held accountable for their abuse? And why aren't victims protected? And I will say, I think the more genuinely we can ask and explore these questions, the better. I think sometimes we ask these questions, but we sort of shout them out of frustration, and we're not able to like engage in genuine or productive conversation around it. The other thing I'll say is that the domestic violence field is really focused on protecting survivors, absolutely for good reason. But we don't talk enough about recovery for abusers, and we are not going to be effective in addressing domestic violence by only helping survivors. We also need to address the reasons that people enact violence. And so I think we also can use a trauma-informed approach to think about how has someone's history of exposure to intimate partner violence and other forms of violence influence the way that they engage in relationships now? And what is the role of institutionalized misogyny? And how does toxic masculinity impact men and boys? And what role does that have to play in intimate partner violence? So thinking statistically, though, about why people don't leave, we also know that these types of dynamics don't necessarily end when the victim escapes. Abusers frequently continue to engage in these types of behavior after someone escapes, and abusive dynamics actually can be more intense when someone leaves because the abuser then feels a loss of control. So statistically, victims are actually at the most, in the most danger when they escape. So a fifth of homicide victims who had restraining orders were murdered within 2 days of getting the order, and a third are murdered within the first month. So again, these are really, really heavy statistics to think about. So I like to think about or reframe it as it's not that victims choose to stay, it's more that they're unable to escape. So thinking through like why people don't leave, there's a lot of good reasons that people don't leave. And again, I think this is part of believing people who disclose abuse. It's not just believing them that the abuse is happening, but trying to believe and understand and empathize with their position. So certainly there's a lot of fear that the violence will intensify or even become lethal if the person escapes, the thought that maybe this is normal, a lot of shame. And so you can see different reasons here, but I also want to mention at the very end of this list is love, that very often victims feel a genuine sense of love and connection with their abusive partner. And that's not something for us to stigmatize or shame or think that that's twisted. It's a challenge for us to really expand our understanding that this is really nuanced, that this might be someone that they have children with and want to maintain their family, and that abusive people can often be really charming, and that this person might just want the violence to stop, but not the relationship to end entirely. So again, we want to try and get a more clear understanding of what's going on for people. I want to speak briefly to like the systemic barriers to escape, because it's not just an individual thing that keeps someone trapped in relationships. There are these systems that also contributed to it. So we see sometimes that when people call 911, victims end up getting arrested or charged, or they get convinced either by their abuser who's there, or even by the legal system not to file charges or to plead down for a lesser charge. A lot of times people talk about getting an order of protection. I will say if you've worked with people who've had an order of protection or who have experienced intimate partner violence, very frequently you'll hear people say a piece of paper is not going to keep me safe. And they're absolutely right. We saw that it doesn't keep people safe or necessarily alive. Unfortunately, what it does is give people the piece of paper that they need in order to move through our systems. And so it becomes something they need for a systemic reason, but it doesn't actually typically keep them much safer. We talked about shelters that allow, places that allow pets or older children. There, in general, just aren't enough shelter beds, but especially shelter beds for men experiencing domestic violence or people who are transgender or gender nonconforming can be really, really challenging to find a place where they can have find a shelter bed. And then thinking about substance use and shelters, a lot of shelters are going to require complete and total abstinence. And for someone who is not at that place in their substance use recovery, that creates a barrier to them accessing a safe roof and resources as far as like their relationship needs. And then again, there's just sort of like a lack of societal support where we normalize violence. There's a lot of rationalization for abusers' behaviors, and women's worth is often kind of contingent on their relationship status. So we talked briefly about the ACEs and thinking, again, kind of big picture of like the societal context of intimate partner violence and substance use. We know that there are like societal norms that directly or indirectly excuse violence. Let's say violence in general, but violence against women and other certain groups are certainly more excused in our society. But we also have a lot of messages about it, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. But we also know that beliefs about substance use can be really gendered. So men's use of alcohol and other drugs can sometimes be tolerated differently than a woman's. We see that a lot of women can be blamed for the abuse that they've experienced, either implicitly or explicitly, and then other people kind of accept that argument. So these are things that we need to be mindful of and be really intentional about kind of how we approach. So we have this dual challenge of trying to empower people with a sense of responsibility for making changes for their substance use, while simultaneously dispelling the idea that they're responsible for their partner's behavior. We want to help survivors feel like they're competent, that they have the ability to make decisions for themselves, that they're empowered to take care of themselves. But we also know that abstinence can both increase and decrease stress for people. So it can decrease stress in that there's fewer problems maybe that the person experiences that was associated with their substance use. But we also know that there are reasons that people use substances, and very often it's a coping skill. So when we take that away from someone, we need to be really certain that we've worked with them sufficiently to make sure that they have enough other coping skills to supplement. I know we're running out of time here. We want to think about these 4 different areas. Social isolation, like we've seen, is really common among survivors. So we want to help people think about how they can make decisions about like new activities and pastimes. We want to address people's parenting needs. We definitely have kind of talked about financial and legal concerns, but we also want to think about relapse prevention. And we know that re-victimization by abusive partners poses a really significant risk for relapse for survivors. So we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to include it. This is a medical power and control wheel. So these are some of the ways that we as service providers inadvertently can contribute to re-traumatization, that we can take and exercise power and control over the people that we serve. So things like asking, why don't you just leave? Why do you put up with that? Why would you let him do that to you? Not taking someone seriously, kind of prescribing divorce, or really deciding that we know best for for someone, we know for someone what's best for them and telling them that this is what they need to do. So these are things that, again, come from typically a well-intentioned place, but that we need to be really intentional and vigilant about our interactions with survivors and make sure we're not replicating those same dynamics of power and control. So just like the equality wheel kind of offers some other ways of engaging in relationships, this is a wheel called the empowerment through advocacy that offers us some other ways of interacting with people that is not based on power and control, but will empower individuals. So believing and validating people's experiences, acknowledging the injustice they've experienced, respecting people's autonomy, I think is a huge one. That one is probably the one that is most challenging for us. So that might be worth thinking about more within your programs and teams of how you can be more intentional about respecting people's autonomy, helping people plan for future safety. Again, here I would link this closely with respecting autonomy and knowing that we might need to adopt kind of a harm reduction approach. Promoting access to community services. Y'all have done some great brainstorming here and being able to network about different resources that could be available, and respecting confidentiality. So I want to end by just saying this was a lot that we went through pretty quickly today, and this is really heavy material. And in all my work with trauma survivors, there is something about intimate partner violence that has affected me differently professionally. That's just really, I think it's the interpersonal nature of it that tends to invite kind of this dissociation or flooding of feeling really overwhelmed by the work or feeling sort of like checked out and tuned out. And I will say we talk a lot about self-care in this field, and the more I have worked in the field, the more I really see it as a necessity and not an indulgence. We could do a whole other training on self-care. I'll say self-care doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it's things like you have to go to the doctor or the dentist or do your laundry. But it can also be something to sort of tend to yourself. So I want to end by asking you all, if you want to enter it into the Q&A, you're welcome to, if it helps to see other people's responses. But to just take a moment to yourselves to identify one specific thing that you're going to do today to take care of yourselves, because you all started your morning by participating in this webinar and sitting with and thinking about some really heavy material. And I think it's a good practice to make an intention to do something to also take care of yourself. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. All right. So that brings us to the end of our time today. If there are any other questions or comments, we can address those now. But thank you all for spending your morning with me.
Hello, Susie. Thank you so much for presenting today. And for those, there are a few questions. If you're able to give us about 5 minutes, and for those, I know some of you might have to hop off. Just want to say thank you to you and to the Department of Children and Families, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Association organization for funding today's webinar. For those who would like to stay on, Susie, are you able to stay on for a few more minutes and answer some questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
So one of the first questions that we have here, how do you move forward with a parent who is with an abuser and wants to stay in the relationship but is working a case plan to be reunified with their children.
Can you say that again?
How do you move forward with a parent who is with an abuser and wants to stay in that relationship, but is working a case plan to be reunified with their children?
Yeah, so my guess is that the concern here is that a reunification plan might be less likely by staying in the relationship. I would probably recommend kind of a harm reduction approach here of being able to think about what needs to happen in the relationship in order to still make it possible to move forward with their reunification plan, and how can they manage and reduce the risks of their relationship, and where are some areas where there's potential to increase their own safety, what kinds of plans can they put in place to address their child's safety, and what are some areas of concern and how can they try and address those.
Next is, as counselors, what do we do with information related to DV? Is there a way to report? Do we call the police or just encourage the clients to do so?
Yeah, so this kind of comes up on the medical power and control wheel. So we absolutely cannot call the police without someone's consent. Domestic violence does not fall under an exception to confidentiality. We're working with an adult who still has the right to privacy around what's happening in their relationship, and it can absolutely feel like a significant violation of someone's privacy for us to call and make a report that this is happening. So what we can do is, I think, try and talk with the person about ways to address safety. I would probably use the equality wheel to try and talk through, like, what kinds of things do you think are going okay in your relationship? What kind of concerns do you have? But it's absolutely not our role to tell someone that you have to report this. And again, although it comes from our own concern for someone's safety, that can really replicate that kind of coercive decision-making that we obviously want to avoid.
Okay, great. And then one more. As counselors, we did that one. Yes. Care to comment on the trauma experienced by perpetrators? I find that many have trauma under the need to dominate and control. I work in forensic MH/SA cases. And then how long should it take to do a DV offender evaluation?
So that's a few questions. I would say I have a lot of comments on perpetrators' need to control. I think that, again, I don't think that the field of intimate partner violence does enough to address perpetrators and their needs and their trauma histories. In general, I think when people are demonstrating a need to control, it's usually because they don't feel like they have enough control in their lives. And I think that looks different, especially if we're talking about male perpetrators. I think that looks different for men because we think of men as having a lot of control, and in many ways they do. But again, a lot of perpetrators are people who've experienced their own trauma. And I think just like messages around what it means to be a male survivor of trauma, and the ways that, like, a culture that promotes toxic masculinity strips men of their ability to grieve and mourn and acknowledge the ways that they've been hurt, I think gets translated into a need to control. So I think there need to be some pretty significant systemic shifts in the ways that we address male trauma, because it's usually, I think of the phrase like hurt people. And so I think a lot of men who've experienced trauma don't have the personal and systemic resources available to them that they need in order to heal from their trauma. And this is sort of what we see happen as a result.
Okay, thank you, Susie. And now we're going to, and thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. And we're now going to conclude our webinar with just some logistics here. When I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's new website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor. Please register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for webinars through our WebEx link and when you set up your profile in FADA's system. This helps connect your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. The sender will be messenger@WebEx. The evaluation will close at midnight on Monday, September 16th. And if you do not receive your survey, please contact me at dperez@fada.org. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day, and please hold for the evaluation.